Hello.
Hi, my dear.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Am I in the light and am I audible?
Uh, you are audible. You just have to tilt your yeah phone a
A little
little so
bit?
that yes,
Is that
that's
better?
better. That's
Super,
better.
super.
Yes. So how have you been?
You know, considering everything, really, I've been well, thank you. It's been a bit of a manic year, I know, for all of us.
Yes,
So
yes.
really, just glad to have kind of made it this far in
I
one
know.
piece. Yeah,
I know. I know.
yeah.
And
With so
finally,
much to be
our
grateful for.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
finally, this session, which was also due for so long, is happening after so many hiccups.
I know, I know. It's so lovely to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. And we've sort of been chatting on Instagram and sort of,
Yes.
we've been in touch. And
Yes, yes,
it's really
yes.
lovely that, we managed to do this. So thank you so much for
Yes.
having me over.
Our pleasure, absolutely. So, for those of you who've tuned in, let me just quickly do an introduction. And for those of you who would like to know a little more about her. So, Janice Pariat is the author of 3 books. Her first book was Boats on Land, which was a collection of short stories. This is the book. And she also wrote a novel called Seahorse, and her latest was Nine Chambered Heart. She was awarded the Young Writer Award from the Sahitya Academy and the Crossword Book Award for Fiction in 2013. Her work, including art reviews, book reviews, fiction, and poetry, has featured in a wide selection of national magazines and newspapers. In 2014, she was the Charles Wallace Creative Writing Fellow at the University of Kent, UK. And currently, she stays in New Delhi with a cat of many names.
I must warn you, you might hear my cat of many names intruding upon our
So,
session at some point. He pays very little heed to these sort of niceties.
so what is the name?
Well, officially Vincent, because he has a
Oh,
little scrunched up ear, and I thought that was
okay,
most appropriate. Except he
okay.
has not an artistic bone in him. But that's his official name. He is also called Kitty, mostly.
You
The
refer to him
only
as Kitty in most of your social media posts, yes.
Yes, I just feel like if that's the one he mostly responds to, I will be respectful of that.
Yes. Good. So, just a hi to all of you who've joined in. And I'm sorry if I'm unable to say hi to each of you individually, just a common hi to all of you. Before we start, Janice, I'll just to set the mood, I will quickly
Yes.
read just 2 lines from one of your stories. Um, this is from the story called Sky Graves from Boats of Land. It wasn't often that Bahem told stories. He would sit in silence, listening to the others, his eyes fixed on the glowing coal. On nights that were a trifle colder and quieter, though, he could be persuaded. If he'd had a drink, smoky rice beer, or a sharp, stinging glass of clear kiad, someone would ask for a story about love. And like at the beginning of so many stories, the room would transform, assembled anew with words. So here we are today. I don't have beer. I do have my cup of coffee, and we hope to cheers to you.
And to you.
And we do hope to get together and listen to a master storyteller.
Hmm.
So really, it does feel like you're sitting in the center, and it's like a little next to a fireplace, and we
Yes.
are all sitting around you trying to listen to you. So let me start, Janice. right at the beginning. Now, I heard somewhere Neil Gaiman saying that the Chronicles of Narnia inspired him to be a writer.
Yeah.
What are your literary influences? Is there one person, or is there like a group of people who inspired you to become a writer?
Yeah. So this is a question that I do get, off and on, and I always have sort of this one particular response to it, because it's something that's deeply, deeply important to me. I would say that my earliest literary influences are actually people who have never written a book, and who probably don't really know how to read or write. But I did grow up in a community of very, very skilled storytellers. I grew up in Shillong, I grew up in Assam, and the community is the Khasis, of course, one of the communities in Meghalaya. And we are mostly an oral community. We didn't for the longest time have a script, and so our histories and our identity and our geography was always marked and carried through by stories. And so I think before I even learned to be a writer, I learned to be a listener. And I think that even now, if someone were to ask me for any sort of writing advice, I would say, yes, read a lot, but also listen a lot. And I think that before I started writing stories, I loved to be told stories. And I think that little passage that you read out from Boats on Land connects to this answer so pertinently, precisely because of that. My influences are oral storytellers, and my book, Boats on Land, is my homage to all of these storytellers who wouldn't find a mention in a library or on a, an anthology, or any such authoritative print medium. But for me, the oral is what inspires the written, and I try never to forget that.
So it must be such a rich heritage of oral storytelling in your community. And I'm sure there's still so much to tap. There's still so much to cull from there and make it your own, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like, especially now, it's even more important to go back and listen more carefully, because stories, if you don't listen to them, they die. And we
Absolutely.
can't let that happen, because these aren't just stories. They are a way of looking at the world. They are a way of understanding our past. They're a way of understanding our landscape. And so it's something that I dip into, very, very deeply, and as often as I can. This wealth of oral storytelling that that I was so lucky to grow up, within as a child. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I actually will start from your latest, which is Nine Chambered Heart. I know Boats of Land is your I just want to tell the viewers that I'm sorry if I'm unable to read your comments right now. I'll definitely go back to it at the end of it. I don't want to get disturbed and sort of, I don't want our conversation to get hampered. So yeah, I'll start with Nine Chambered Heart, which I must say, I read it 2 years back, I think in 2018. And by the time I opened the book and I went to the second chapter, I was enthralled. Absolutely. I was enthralled because it was such a unique style of storytelling, which I had never read before, And I know it's been translated to 10 languages, right?
Yes.
Yes, it's been translated to 10 languages. And for those of you who haven't read it, it's a map of a young woman's mind, but told from the viewpoint of 9 men who loved her, who lost her, or who she may have loved or lost. So it's about her, but told from the viewpoint of them. And so, what was that thing which inspired you to try this kind of structure? And also the second person narrative. I always find books with second person narratives, really interesting because it takes the whole story to a different level. So,
Yeah.
what was it that made you choose these structures and these
Right.
narratives?
Right. Okay. So I feel like in some ways, if there is some sort of spectrum of my writing years, Boats on Land would fall on one end, and Nine Chambered Heart, which, as you just said, is my most recent book, this would fall somewhat on the other end because they're very, very different books. One is very deeply rooted in place, in geography, in community, and Nine Chambered Heart is actually placeless. It has no anchors of geography in that sense. And for me, this was a really exciting experiment, in all honesty. I think as writers, we have to have fun writing and
Absolutely.
telling stories. And what better way to do that than to just experiment with something like this. I also teach creative writing at a university in Delhi. So sometimes I feel that we get so caught up in what is meant to, what are the literary craft elements that go into a piece of writing, and these are the things you absolutely can't do without. And I wanted to write a story that took something like setting, context, and did away with it, in order to see what kind of story remained. What would happen to a story in which you take away geography, in which you take away the anchor of setting? Would it survive? And if it does survive, what kind of story does it become? And I was interested in that. So it's almost like a little science experiment, oddly, where you go and you kind of add one element and you take one out and you see, what's left, and what kind of alchemy you can conjure in your little study at your desk. I think the other small sort of I think it's more sort of a rebellion rather than a motivation, was also that I felt slightly boxed in by the label Northeastern writer after something like the Boats on Land came out, because it is, like I said, very much about place. And I want to be a borderless writer. I really do. I think that we live in a world which is policed and bordered, where we need visas and passports to go anywhere.
Absolutely.
But as a writer, I want to be free to travel wherever my stories take me. And this, I feel, is the last sort of frontier, the last free frontier, our minds, and where they can take
Absolutely.
us. So in some ways, Nine Chambered Heart is a little bit of a cheeky sort of gauntlet thrown to the ground. And, me saying, here's a book with no setting. So does that just make me a writer? And not any other kind of writer, a woman writer or a Northeastern writer or even an
Absolutely.
Indian writer, right? And as for your question regarding the structure of the piece, I wanted it to resemble something like, if you just picture it, something like our galaxy, where the woman is the sun at the center of the story, and all these voices swirl and, you know, move around her like the planets. Um, and the reason why I use, as you pointed out, the second person, the you, in the narrative is because I wanted the narrative direction to be, what is the word? I wanted it to be focused to her. The you unites the narratives because it guides our eye towards the woman at the center. And it keeps what could be very, very disparate narratives together. And they're held by the you.
Absolutely. And in doing that, you've actually, I mean, that's my reading of it. You've actually handled a theme which is so universal, the theme of love,
Love.
right? And because it is so true, I feel you've made the readers work quite a bit, because the readers is actually thinking and pondering, and you know the words are lingering on. You do say it's focused on the you, but I feel it sort of puts the microscope back on us and how we look at love, and the different formulas of love. You know, the kind of mistakes we made, or what are we thinking is how we see them. Maybe that's not the truth. And the other thing besides love, which I thought I started thinking, and I'm sure all readers, once they read that, started thinking, is the whole language of memory. I don't know if there's something called that, but you know, the whole language of memory. I mean, how do memories stay in our so-called memory box? It's only through our eyes. So you've actually, as I said, you've made us think, because that's what I went through. You know, okay, where did I go wrong, and you know, what did I do? You know, so did you intend to do that? Did you want your readers to do some work, like, hey, there, now go, you know, ponder on it?
Very much so. I think that actually, with a book like this, because of the kind of gaps in the narrative, and I don't mean something like plot holes, I mean literally the space around the words, because something like setting is removed, there is room for the reader to immerse themselves into the story by imagining those details for themselves. It's almost it's almost like a blank canvas on which there is just a faint outline of a picture of a woman in this case. And the reader is invited, it's an invitation to examine the stories that we tell about other people and the stories that we tell about ourselves. I think memory is made up largely of stories that we believe in about others in our lives. And so this book works with, you know, with both, and encourages you, invites you to think about how you might have viewed somebody in your life and how they might have looked at you, and how those stories sometimes just don't match. And that's life, you know. There's no grand and neat resolution in the book, because there is no grand and neat resolution in life. We stumble on unknowing and slightly uncertain and unsure and a little, you know, fearful, a little hopeful. And that's how we survive. That's how we manage.
Absolutely. And in doing that, what I feel, I haven't read Seahorse, but both in Nine Chambered and Boats on Land, the sense of mystery is always so palpable. You know, at the end of the book of Nine Chambered, you're wondering, okay, where did she go? You know, what happened to her? At least it definitely happened to me, you know. So that sense of mystery is always there, because you really don't get to know her or you at all. It's a nameless, placeless, you don't know anything. So yeah, I mean, how beautifully you capture that sense of mystery. You know, for those who haven't read, I must say, you know, that's the That's another uniqueness of you. In fact, the way I look at it, I always feel that, if there's a creative writing class, there should be a Janice Pariat genre of writing.
You're too kind,
Um,
Mala.
no. There should be, because
That's so
your
sweet.
style is absolutely different. Now, coming to Boats on Land, your
Yeah.
first one,
Yeah.
I must say that once you read this doesn't look like a debut author's work. It
Thank
is,
you.
there are 15 stories here.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it won the 2 awards that it did. And there are 15 stories here. It spans over a time, right? Right from
Yeah.
the
The mid
1800s, maybe,
1800s. Yeah, the mid
to
1800s.
contemporary,
Yeah, yeah. And the
to
stories are
contemporary
arranged
times.
chronologically as well. So you begin in the mid 1800s, and you end, the last story is sort of a contemporary now. Yeah.
So for this one, I was just curious to know that, did you think of the relationships or the emotions or the subjects that you want to touch upon and then write, or did one story unfold after the other as you were writing?
Yeah, right. They are actually chronologically not written in the way that they are in the book. So it's sort of quite a mishmash. I started with, something that comes much later in the book and then ended with something else. So it wasn't a direct sort of flow of stories. So as you see them is not the way that they were written, for sure. But I must admit that these are stories that I've carried with me all my life. A lot of them are inspired by stories that were told to me, as I said, which is why a lot of the stories feature storytellers in the act of storytelling. Because these were such important sort of influences and inspiration for me. They are stories that my father's told, my grandfather, I've heard from strangers and friends at weddings and funerals. The Khasis, or the people from the hills, really do love a good tale. And they love spinning, as you say, a good yarn. So a lot of these stories are also quite fantastical. And I think one of the things that I did, actually, the only deliberate thing I might have actually set out to do with the stories in Boats on Land is bring together what I saw in previous books that had been written by writers in Shillong, that fell in two camps, right? So you had literature that was, by Anjum Hassan, Siddharth Deb, very realist, gritty sort of, stories about Shillong, and they're fantastic books. And then you have the other literature, which is sort of folk tales of the Khasis, folk tales of Meghalaya. And I thought, actually, this is not how I've experienced, these stories while growing up. They both coexisted, the fantastical and the gritty, and the extraordinary and the mundane. And I really wanted to bring that together in the way that I had experienced these coexisting realities, all my life. Which is why it aspires to sort of magic realism, where, you're being told a story about a gentleman who's just vanished and, taken away by water fairies, or
Fairies.
yes, exactly, right? So these were stories that were told to me with a straight face, with absolute seriousness, and who's to say that, these aren't real for people who, who live and sort of interact with this landscape and with this kind of culture. So really, that was my only deliberate intention behind the stories in Boats on Land, for sure.
But what I also noticed is, yes, you've weaved in folklore and reality, and it's a beautiful mishmash of both. But you've also touched upon topics which are very universal. They may be, sort of localized at that point, but there's one story which has mental health in it, if I remember. Yeah, so there are sort of universal topics which you've dealt with. And there's a little bit of political unrest also in the background, which, so you've not sort of forced it upon the reader that, okay, this is the hard fact, but a beautiful weaving in of both. What I noticed about both on land and in this lockdown particularly, I've been reading a lot of writings from the Northeast, and I see the different kinds of styles. Your absence of glossary, absolute absence of glossary, using not only names of items like manja for the kites. I'm sure somebody who wouldn't know would wonder what manja is, but you've also used the food names, which actually add to the authenticity of the story. I mean, for me, it was beautiful. Because all the food names were like, okay, I what does this taste like? It sounds exotic. So I think that also adds on. The absence of glossary also adds to the beauty. And I know it's a conscious decision on your part.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a very, very deliberate decision not to include a glossary or footnotes or, anything to explain the words out of the text. In fact, my editor and I had a sort of a long conversation about this, and it was very clear for her and for me that this was the way it would be. And it is also a hugely political decision, I think, because,
Of course.
these
and you haven't itemized them either.
No, absolutely not, because they, language is like this. This is how we speak. We meld. We bring together, and that ought to just lie on the page the way that it is. And of course, I don't mean to. I don't mean to distance my reader by doing this. Absolutely not. In fact, for some of the words, there is a sense that you can understand what it means by the sentence that follows or by the response of a character to, what's been
There's a
said.
checkered cloth, I remember, which you've used the word and you've described it. Yeah.
Jankarsha, yes, exactly, right.
Jankarsha,
It's not a deliberate attempt to distance anyone, because there is a sense that you can figure it out.
Absolutely.
But also, I think it's really important that when you're reading stories from another culture, from another part of the world, that there might be words and there might be names, concepts that crop up in these stories that are given to you in another language, which is not English. And I think it's really important to be comfortable with that not knowing, and to be comfortable with the unfamiliarity. Life will throw us into the company of others, of people we who might be very different from us, and who might eat very different things and speak very differently and think about the world very differently. But it's okay. We don't have to always know everything in order to be able to empathize, in order to be able to listen to stories, in order to be able to understand them as human beings, as fellow human beings. So it is an attempt on my part to say, look, you will not know everything. Life never offers you that luxury, but it's okay. We just, we deal with it, and we appreciate what we can, and it's okay if you can't understand everything. I feel like we also live in a time when it's so easy to Google, to kind of find out, and we are constantly...
Also, all the instructions are there to do everything in life.
Exactly, right? So we're so used to having sort of information at our fingertips, and, other humans are not like that. You cannot find out about another person and another culture completely, through a Google search. You can't. you interact and you immerse, and there will be some things that you get and some things that you don't.
Absolutely true. Also, now let's come to your style of writing. I can make out from your Instagram post that you find solace in nature, right? And I find the reflection of that in the very lyrical way you write. Your writing sometimes reads like a poem. Um, and we also see your interest in botanicals. I mean, you're very, very passionate about botanicals. So I was just wondering, is it your growing up years in Assam, in Meghalaya, in the lush hills and valleys,
Yeah.
is that what influenced you to get so close to nature, to find solace in nature, and then to reflect that in your writing?
Yeah. Mahua, I wish I could give you a sort of a beautifully romantic answer and say, yes, it was because I grew up amidst all of this beauty in the Northeast that I sort of, have grown to appreciate green growing things. But honestly, when I was young and living in these absolutely stunning sort of, out of the way places all over Assam and Meghalaya, I didn't give a shit, basically. I was more interested in running around,
Playing.
playing, bothering my parents, bugging my sister, reading my books, and just thinking, oh my God, when am I gonna get out of here and live my life? And you're young and you're a
Yeah,
little
yeah.
stupid and you're a little reckless, and you only realize now, as I do in my older years, that my God, I had the most blessed childhood, growing up, as you said, in these beautiful sort of parts of our country. And I think that my slight obsession with botanicals, as you might have noticed, right now comes from a few things. Um, One is the book that I'm writing next actually deals with or uses botany
Okay.
very sort of very deliberately at through the narratives, so it plays a part in the stories. But apart from that, I think what's also really changed me is moving to a little apartment with a small garden.
Okay.
And over the lockdown period, especially, I've learned to, live with them and take care of them and sort of watch them grow and wilt and grow back and, sort of bloom. And I think that's really reawakened something in me that I didn't quite sort of know, existed. And of course, I think you're right that it has something to do with, growing up in places that were so sort of, beautiful and green and just spoke to you in those sort of natural, ways. Um, and of course, the other thing that's come to preoccupy perhaps all of us at some level or the other is, the question, what are we doing to our planet?
Absolutely.
And how are we sort of going about our daily lives without taking this into consideration as much as we can, as often as we can. And what better way to learn about living in the world as lightly as possible than through other living things around you. They show you that you can live gently in the world and quietly and blossom and sort of just be. And I think that's sort of something that really has come to mean so much to me.
But I've seen you have a flower press. You
Yeah.
do. I mean, there's so many avenues of, sort of letting your creative juices flow. Uh, you know, you have a whole lot of other interests also, which sort of, I'm sure, come into your writing in some way or the other, right?
Yeah, I think
So
so. And I think actually for me, Mawa, and I've been asked this question a lot by younger writers, newer writers, of, what do you do when you get a writer's block and how do you sort of deal with that? And actually, what I would say is if you're leading, what's more important than writing every day and getting those 1,000 words on a page every day is that you are leading a creatively engaged life. So that
absolutely.
your avenues of creativity, as you said, are wide and multiple. So that writing doesn't become the only sort of
Only.
outlet for that energy, because you can't place that kind of pressure, I think, on any one thing. It's
True.
just not, sustainable. So on the day that you can't write, you press flowers, or you watch a movie, or you see some art, or
Absolutely.
you listen to some music. So I think that's really important, that balance.
Coming to music, in fact,
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, in Boats on Land, the playlist of Grace, I think, in the story
Yeah.
Laitlam,
Yeah.
are they your favorites also? Roxette and Shaking Stevens and Jason Donovan and Debbie Gibson, a whole lot of other names. Do
You
tell me
know,
they are your favorites also.
I have to admit, I have to admit that they are more my elder sister's favorite uh,
Okay, okay.
sort of music, because it's very much of that time. And she was, of course, a cool teenager, much cooler than me. At that point in time when all of that music was so big, and we'd listen to them on little, I think they, little cassettes.
Cassettes,
Um,
yes. And you
yes,
mentioned
yes,
mixtape, and I'm like, okay, I
yes,
had so many mixtapes. I mean, she's
exactly,
talking of
exactly.
my zamana.
Exactly. So, music is such a wonderful indicator of time, and a certain point in time, a certain sort of point in history. Of course, movies do this, so well. Because as soon
Yes,
as you
yes,
hear a
yes.
certain kind of soundtrack, you're immediately taken to that period. So for that story, you're so perceptive, I have to say. No one's ever asked me that before, but you're absolutely right. The music, is in there because it's meant to conjure a feeling of the early 90s, the mid
Yes,
90s,
yes,
that,
yes,
that
absolutely.
time. Yeah.
And since you bring up music and movies, I mean, since we spoke about this, I also wanted to ask you one thing. We had a poet who won the Nobel Prize this year,
Yeah.
Nobel Prize for Literature, right? And I have heard from so many of my friends who've discovered poetry in this, lockdown period, or who are listening to more of poetry. I almost read 3 to 4 poems every day, and do you think it's the whole thing of culture and literature arts which actually help us sort of withstand the
Yeah.
trauma of these very very trying times, to sort
Yeah.
of face each day, and that is the way forward, I mean.
Yeah. And I really hope that, the recognition of this leads to us living in a world where artists are supported in a way that's,
Absolutely.
sustainable and sort of good for them, because that clearly hasn't happened, in too many parts of the world, if at all. But the recognition that, when we had nothing else, we had art, we had
Absolutely.
movies, we had music, we had poetry, as you said, we had books. And,
Books.
these aren't just free floating entities that just enter your life out of nowhere. They have been created by people who have spent a lot of time, a lot of energy working to bring that, to you, to create it for you, to bring it to you. And each of these things that we've taken comfort in is part of somebody else's life. And I really hope that is recognized, a lot more. They say an age must be judged by the way their poets are treated. And
Absolutely.
That's really something that we, especially now, need to think about so much more. But you're right.
And yeah, and I would say that's one of the positives, of such, pandemics or plague or whatever. I mean, they say that Shakespeare wrote 3 of his plays during the plague, King Lear, Macbeth, and one more, I can't remember which one. But
He did.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean,
And of
these
course,
are
not to fall into sort of this cycle of, or, this sort of cycle of, pressure of productivity.
of
It's absolutely
productivity.
okay to do
Absolutely.
nothing.
Absolutely.
And
I
just
think there
read
is a
King Lear.
percentage of the population who did go through that in the early days of the lockdown of, I have to do this and tick all the boxes, and I saw so much of it in the social media, in fact, And coming to that and coming to the social media, I wanted to ask you one thing, that nowadays, the distance between the reader and the writer has definitely decreased, has shortened. It was not the case, say, even 2 decades back. You would read a book and you would sit and dream and just hope that, you could meet the author or whatever, have a conversation. But now, with the advent of social media, not just social media, with literary meets, you can be at a barge listening to Jan Martel talking about Life of Pi. You can personally connect with an author. And I hear of writers, I've heard interviews where writers say that, oh, I'm being asked to get on, to social media and, sort of give a face to my name. Now, obviously, for us readers, it's a boon. But I wanted to ask you, are there times when you feel that the distance is a little too close and it's a little too stifling because there's too much of discussion about the books, about the style, about everything, Do you find it stifling at times?
Well, the good thing about social media is that you can switch it off. So, if you ever feel that, it's just too much, or you're being too distracted, or you're sort of feeling a bit scattered because you've kind of been on a screen, looking through stuff, scrolling through stuff all day, then really just put it away. For me, this community has been incredibly fun and nourishing and just really, really warm. And I've had, such an incredible time actually interacting with, readers, or, people who might not have read any of my books, but who are just interested in, literature or other people's books or whatever. And I found it really, really nourishing, especially through the lockdown time, where people, I think, gathered in some ways around, Instagram, especially. I'm really not fond of Twitter or anything like that, but I feel like this community has been very nourishing, and I've really enjoyed that. So luckily, it hasn't ever actually reached that point where I feel stifled or it's too much and I can't take this. But if it ever did, I hope it wouldn't, but if it ever did, it would be, for me, a solution of just putting it away and just doing something else for a while. Sorry, that's my cat. If you can hear him, he's meowing.
Oh, you did predict this. You did predict this, right? So
he wants to desperately sort of be part of this, Noah.
Now I wanted to just ask you, once this whole thing is over, the quarantine, the lockdown, and we are hoping to get back to a so-called new world, any thoughts on how maybe you want to bring about some changes in your life? We all, I'm sure, all of us are introspecting. and
Yeah.
making changes.
Yeah.
So
Oh, that's
any
that's
thoughts on that?
that's such a good question. But I love that everyone's remarks at this point are all directed at Vincent.
All directed at the cat?
Yes. Yeah, he has a knack of stealing attention away from me. So understandably, so he's very, very cute. But that's a really
Is he
good
around you?
question.
Can you just, is he
I
around you?
think he's in the garden at the moment.
Oh, okay,
Trying to
okay.
get in. So I will ignore
Okay.
him and get back to your very, very good question. I think it's something that we've all been thinking about, no? Especially all
Absolutely.
of these many past few months, about what does this mean for us, and what kind of changes, will we bring about in our lives from now on. And there are a couple of things. One, I noticed that my cycle of consumption really just broke. I have to admit that, without really realizing it, I was caught in a cycle of sort of, oh, let's, buy this, or this looks good, clothes, whatever, just things that you never knew you needed until you saw them and you thought, oh my God, I've wanted this all my life. And this is what capitalism does so well, right? It creates
Absolutely.
that desire in you. So that's one thing.
Your wants list keep on increasing.
Yes, exactly. It's never ending. So that's one thing that broke for me. And I realized I have more than enough and I do not need anything more. And even if, I do decide to get something for a special occasion, it needs to be from, the most local source as possible. And how important it is to support those kind of, initiatives, your local tailor in your local market, your local sort of cloth shop, get stuff stitched. So that kind of thing. And the other thing, which I think maybe all of us have really been thinking about because we haven't been able to do it, is travel. And how we have to reassess how much of a burden we place on our planet because we travel so much without really thinking about it. It had become so easy to hop on a flight and just go anywhere, to kind of just drive off, whatever, right? So I don't know all the answers. I wish I had some sort of, ready-made, here's what we should all do, so that, things get better. But I really do want to reassess how often I travel and why, and how I can live more lightly, as they say, right? Without placing too much of a burden in the places where we live. Sorry, I will have to ask Kitty to be let in. Oh, thank you. Right, he is in.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
On that note, I just wanted to tell everybody, can we end this and come back again? Because I think there are only 2 minutes left and I just have about 3 more questions. So can we quickly end this and come back so that we are not stopped in the middle of so all of you who are here, please come back. I'm coming live once again. Okay. Thank you.